Welcome to our third Poets and Writers event of the fall semester. We'll continue to have Poets and Writers in the spring, so please look for other Poets and Writers events in the college calendar. But we're so pleased today. Please welcome Dr. Richard A. Courage. He's the editor of Roots of the Black Chicago Renaissance, New Negro Writers, Artists, and Intellectuals, 1893 to 1930. That was published just last year. And he's the co-author of the 2011 publication, The Muse in Bronzeville, African American Creative Expression in Chicago, 1932 to 1950. Professor Courage is a SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor, and we are especially proud to say he's a Westchester Community College Professor of English, where he's taught African American literature, modern American writers, short story, history of ideas honors, and all levels of writing classes. This program format is a conversation about his writing and research with several of his student scholars, and I'll let Dr. Courage introduce the rest of the panel, but please welcome Professor Courage and his scholars.
Thank you, Professor Tim. I am delighted to be here tonight. I should say I will be off and on with this pirate patch. I have a kind of serious vision issue, so I hope that doesn't distract you. When I thought about how to structure tonight's presentation, what to do as the featured writer, I'm not a poet, I'm a scholarly writer. I thought, look, we're all kind of zoomed out, right? In this digital age of lockdowns and the rest of it. And we've heard an awful lot of talking heads and seen a lot of PowerPoint presentations. So why not try something different? And I thought of two words. I call them the two C's: collaboration and conversation. And those two C's run like a thread through all my scholarly research, my scholarly writing, and my teaching. Let me just be a proud author here. If you were to look at the cover of my first book, The Muse in Bronzeville, with this beautiful Charles White mural, you would see two authors' names: Robert Bone and Richard A. Courage. And Bone, I want to tell you, was actually my professor when I was finishing my PhD at Columbia. And when I sat in his classes, never in a million years did I think I would write a book with him someday. I won't go into the backstory there, but it does lead me to say to all my students, when you're taking a course, you meet a new teacher, stay alert to the opportunities that professor may put in your path. You never know. Maybe it's just learning, hopefully it's learning something new. Maybe it's a letter of recommendation, maybe down the line somewhere, something bigger. And obviously a co-authored book is the product of much collaboration and conversation. Same thing with, here's no PowerPoint, this is all live visuals, guys. Roots of the Black Chicago Renaissance. It's been out about a year now. Two names. I'm the lead editor. My co-editor is a fellow named Christopher Robert Reed, who's a very distinguished historian with about 7 books to his credit. He is himself African-American and a native of Chicago. So he writes as an insider. And Professor Reed and I have a bigger network of scholars, 11 of whom contributed essays to this book. I wrote 3 pieces: the introduction, a middle essay, and then the final essay. And 11 other folks contributed. So again, collaboration, conversation among scholars. And in my classes, you know what? At the end of a class, one measure I have for whether it was successful: who did the talking? If my students talked more than me, it was probably a very good class. So I invited 4 co-presenters today. They know, and I'm going to share with you, I call them my dream team. 3 of them are current students. 1 studied with me some years ago. We've stayed in touch as he's done remarkable things. And let me call on them now. They're actually going to introduce themselves. We'll go in alphabetical order by last name, which means we'll begin with Marcos. If you would introduce
yourself.
yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor, for the they're handing this off to me now so I can introduce myself. Appreciate the time and thank you all for being here. Marcos Lesende, currently a student in Professor Courage's African American Studies or African American Literature class. And I think what interested me more, so to be quite honest, this is not a class that I had to take for any other reason than I just wanted to. This is not going towards any other degree of mine or anything of that nature. It's something that really just always interested me. I grew up in a predominantly African American Latino community. So I've been around the African American culture pretty much my whole life. It's something I grew up in. 90+% of my best friends are all African American. I have an African American son. And I think it was important for me to kind of understand the culture a bit more, understand the struggle a bit more. And with understanding that, I can impart some of that off to my son, and then also do what I can to try to rectify some of the struggles or the concerns and the issues that we're currently facing. But also historically, African Americans have struggled mightily in this country. So historically, just trying to understand that. And I think what we've done in this class is kind of using literature to understand those struggles and understand how to overcome those struggles. So I thank you, Professor, for that. And I'll hand it off to our next presenter. I believe it's Cyrille.
Thank you, Marco. Hi, everyone. I'm honored to be here tonight. Cyrille Njikeng is my name. I'm an actor, filmmaker, a life coach, motivational speaker by passion. I earned my associate degree from Westchester Community College and my master's in fine art from City College of New York. So I was one of the very privileged one to be in Professor Richard Courage class. And a short anecdote, just moved from Cameroon to the United States. I was an undocumented immigrant and finally decided to go back to school, and went to Westchester Community College, still, very poor in English, no writing, I was speaking. And when I took this class, it changed a lot of things in my way of narrating, in my way of speaking, my way of writing. So I'm honored to be here today. I kept in touch with Professor Courage, which means when you have a great professor, you stay in touch with him, right, or her. I have 3 children here in America. I have a 10-year-old son. So my children are African, Jamaican, American, and we know what we're going through right now in this society of being Black in America. I'm concerned anytime I see my children. I don't know what the future holds with them. I'm stay positive, but having an African American son is tough as a parent. So I always stay informed. I want to learn the history, as Marco said. I want to get into the roots of why are we going through the struggle we're going through. And being an African from the motherland, knowing the story of my cousin who left just a boat ride before us is very important. So for me, it's a great privilege to even be part of this discussion and just go through this reading and understanding. The first book was The Muse in Bronzeville. At the time I was a radio host, and Professor and I had an awesome discussion, and it just enlightened me, even more. So every opportunity I have to read, to have discussions, to go to seminars and conferences, when it comes to the history of the African Americans, I take that opportunity up, because most of those stories are not being taught in classes, So today I want you guys to just, brace yourself, put your seatbelt on, and let's have this discussion together. Thank you guys for being here.
And I think Judyth is next.
Hi, everyone. I'm glad you all came tonight. I'm Judyth. I am currently in Professor Courage's African American Literature class. Honored to be on this panel tonight. And this is really important. Before I took this class, I had never even heard of the Black Chicago Renaissance. And it's just so important. I think everybody should know about it. Everybody hears about the Harlem Renaissance, but you very rarely hear about the Black Chicago Renaissance. I've told people about it when I talk about my classes, and everybody's like, I didn't know there was a Chicago Renaissance. So I think it's really important. This book is really important.
And next would be Regina.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I'm grateful for how big the turnout was tonight. and I'm Regina Tucker. I'm 20 years old, currently a student at Westchester Community College. I'm taking Professor Courage's African American literature class, and I really wanted to take this class because in high school, I had the opportunity to take this class, but it didn't work out with my schedule ever, so I saw this opportunity here, and of course I took it, and I just really wanted to learn about African American culture, my culture, and I wanted to really learn about the Black women authors in America, because in high school I was never taught about them, and authors like Margaret Walker and Gwendolyn Brooks I'd never heard of until this class.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I'm really delighted and very proud of you. I should explain the structure of our conversation is the following. We will address three big questions. The first one, more or less based on the content of my first book, The Muse in Bronzeville. The question is, what was the Black Chicago Renaissance and how was it different from the Harlem Renaissance? And after we've talked about that for a few minutes and we have various things to share with you, some things to read, more or less spontaneously. I think we all probably have some notes beside us somewhere. The second question goes back earlier to my second book, which somebody described as a prequel. Actually, the scholar who wrote the foreword said, this is the prequel to The Muse in Bronzeville. The question is, what were the origins and causes of the Black Chicago Renaissance? Where did it come from? How did it evolve? And then our final question, what's the point of going back 100 years or more, reading these old texts by Gwendolyn Brooks, Margaret Walker, Richard Wright, or reading Richard Courage's version of the events? What value do we gain by going back and learning about the cultural history of African Americans in general, and in particular looking at these Renaissance moments? So we'll go through those questions in turn, but as I said, no PowerPoints, no set speeches, no lecture, just rich, well-informed conversation. So let me, if I may, repeat that first question. What was the Black Chicago Renaissance and how did it differ from the Harlem Renaissance? And I'll turn it over to my co-presenters.
Yeah, I can pick that up, Professor. So the Chicago Renaissance, it's very similar to the Harlem Renaissance. What it really was is an influx of creatives, whether in the arts, for example, right, covering a span from jazz to poetry to novel writing to paintings and portraits. It was an influx of creatives in industrial cities. In this particular, obviously, setting would be Chicago, they were really trying to tackle, I would say, a few different issues here. One was the current state of African Americans at the time. I think it's important to understand what was going on around that time period. You're talking a time period between late 1920s, 28, 29, into the 30s and mid 30s. Very important to kind of understand what's going on in America at that time frame. So what they were doing is addressing the current concerns, or the concerns at the time that they were having, those certain struggles that they were going through from a financial perspective, but just overall the struggle that they were going through. But also I think they were tackling the image that was being portrayed at the time of African-American folks in the United States. And they were doing so via their arts, whether that be a Richard Wright in short stories, or whether that be at the time frame, Louis Armstrong came of age in the Chicago Renaissance. And what you'll kind of get from a lot of this literature is, and I always point this out every conversation we have, or for the most of it, is jazz seems to play a very important role in the Chicago Renaissance. It either plays a role in speaking within the music of the struggles that are going on at the particular moment, or it plays more of a soundtrack to what's going on during the Chicago Renaissance. And to kind of just tap into how it differentiates a little bit from the Harlem Renaissance, I would actually, I think Arna Boontem's put it best. It's less gaudy, but closer to realities. I think it's less gaudy for the simple reason that we're going through a Great Depression at the time of the Chicago Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance had a very different financial state that they were going through at that particular moment. I think the Chicago Renaissance was going through a very different time financially, which led to them to speaking more of the realities of what's going on the street and less flair, which I think we got a lot of flair and whatnot from the Harlem Renaissance. Overall, I think both were leaning towards getting a better outcome for African Americans, but I think Chicago kind of stripped away all the flair and said, let's just focus on the realities of the ground here. And I think that's where we kind of see the differentiation between the Chicago Renaissance and the Harlem Renaissance.
I think I want to add on to what Marcos said very well. For me, when I started reading the book, I wanted to understand, before even knowing the difference of both, what does Renaissance means in English, right? For someone who speaks French, I had to go back and research and see that, wow, yeah, it's actually the rebirth, you know, and we have two rebirths. We have one in Harlem, one in Chicago, and Marcos clearly explains what he feels the difference was. But when you look at the word rebirth, we're talking about before rebirth, it means you had already existed before, and then you died, and then you were born. So at this point, there's something to prove, right? There's something to show. Okay, I'm back. I'm here. I have something to show. I have something to prove. It was a renaissance of an ancient African spirit, you know, of all the struggles coming out of Africa, going into slavery, you know, having a civilization before slavery, going into slavery, coming to America, working hard, and then getting somewhat type of freedom, and then start expressing themselves through their art, you know, through writing, poetry, painting, and so forth. You know, so it's very important, you know, as readers the moment you understand that this was a rebirth, then you see the spirit that comes behind that rebirth. You see the spirit that comes behind it. And the museum in Brownsville, you know, when that gives us a clear path, you know, to understanding what this rebirth. And while I was reading, one thing that caught my attention in page 4 of the introduction, which I want to share with you guys, is Professor said it rightly in here. He said the term Renaissance is entirely appropriate. You know, writer, not literary scholar. For in that decade, the 1920s, we're talking about, also a loose but united gathering of Black artists located most significantly in Harlem rediscovered the ancient confidence and sense of destiny of their African ancestors and created a body of art on which future writers and musicians and artists might build, and in which the masses of Blacks could see their own faces and features accurately and lovingly reflected. You know, this view employs the core etymological meaning of Renaissance, rebirth. You know, so it was not only the ability to give people a sense of confidence, but a sense of pride, a sense of consciousness, the Black consciousness, connect the African Americans back to their initial consciousness, which was pride, which was greatness, you know, the ability to be great. You know, so for me, when I found that foundation, it helped me to even, you know, just connect to the story altogether, because I was like, wow, they were not doing it for just for fun. They were doing it because they had something to prove. They had to show that, okay, we're not just savages, we're humans, and we have something to show for it.
And I just wanted to add that because the Great Depression was going on during the Chicago Renaissance, the general public did not care as much as when the Harlem Renaissance was going on, because the general public was suffering themselves because of the Great Depression. Economically, they were down. So they didn't care that the Black community was still racially down.
Yeah. The Depression changed everything for everybody, but it changed things for Black folks even more because of the relative social status situation. Judyth, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I was just going to say another difference between the Harlem and the Chicago Renaissance was that the Harlem Renaissance, a lot of the writers were writing for white people. They were trying to get a white audience. And the Chicago Renaissance, they were Black writers and they were writing for Black people. and they were also helping each other and financing each other, and they, starting their own newspapers and getting the writers out there and known to Black folk.
Yeah, a very interesting part of the story is what I call Black institution building, which had a very, very long history in Chicago, going back to the last part of the 19th century. The artists that came of age in the 30s, and some of the names you've heard, Richard Wright, Margaret Walker, Gwendolyn Brooks, Arna Bontemps, Willard Motley, there's a whole slew discussed in the two books. They had predecessors. They had, you might say, shoulders to stand on. And initially, they tended to be published in Black media, newspapers like the Chicago Defender, or Black magazines, or the Associated Negro Press Service, which served a couple of hundred Black newspapers across the country. But the Depression shifted the grounds, as Regina indicated. Black institutions like Black-owned banks failed, literally went bankrupt. Thousands of people lost their life savings. And unemployment was hitting, for Black women, it was pushing 60% in 1931, I think, pushing 50% for Black men, mass evictions. The newspapers, which had been a place where Black writers could initially publish, they lost half their paid subscriptions. So something, it was a period where sadly, we're getting a feeling for it from our own firsthand experience of pandemic and economic crisis in the last couple of years. What happens in a situation like that? Sometimes the government steps in to kind of save the day. So I have in mind to read something very, very quick here. It'll pick up some of these themes. Let's see it. Here it is. It was written by a fellow several of us have mentioned, Arna Bontemps. Among other things, he was Langston Hughes' best friend and frequent collaborator, although he never became quite as famous as Langston Hughes. But Bontemps was a Louisiana-born poet, novelist. He wrote popular histories, like he brought a whole bunch of people in to work on a history of the Negro in Illinois. He was a writer's writer. And he actually started out in Harlem in the 1920s, publishing his poetry. And then he wound up living in Chicago, working with these other writers. So he actually experienced at firsthand both Renaissances. This is something he wrote. And I think it was one of you, I forget who, quoted about the gaudiness that some people saw in Harlem. Here's some more of that Bontemps quote. Harlem got its Renaissance in the middle 20s, centering around the opportunity contests and the Fifth Avenue Awards dinners. I should tell you, Opportunity was the magazine of a civil rights organization called the National Urban League. And in the mid-20s, they came up with a literary contest. For a while, they had only published sort of social and political pieces. And then somebody said, let's feature Black poets and Black short story writers. And let's have contests to see who are the best. And they started developing awards dinners every year for about 5-6 years. And if you were an aspiring writer, you got that award, you showed up at the dinner, you rubbed shoulders with young Black writers like yourself, you rubbed shoulders with famous white writers like Eugene O'Neill, and with publishers and magazine editors. You got contracts if you were lucky. So those were the opportunity contests. They were held at the New York Civic Club. And these young writers, I think of basically poor Black kids from uptown, coming down to a very swanky location on Fifth Avenue, being served on fine china with crystal goblets. They got the full treatment from the moneyed folks who put these events on. Now, Bontemps goes on to suggest how different Chicago's Renaissance was. 10 years later, he says, Chicago reenacted Renaissance on WPA. No other writer's project in the country produced comparable Negro talent during the Depression. Chicago was definitely the center. And I'll ask my co-presenters, anybody want to talk about the WPA and the Writers Project, or is that my piece?
The WPA, you may have to fill in for me, fill in what I miss.
Will do.
It's the Works Progress Administration, and it was funds from the government, and funds were given to artists to help them, not just writers, but painters and musicians, to help them do their work, to help them be able to do their craft.
Yeah. Just think, just read the headlines. Think American Recovery Act 2020, Build Back Better proposal 2021. That's the government stepping in to avert total chaos and disaster, putting people back to work, doing what needs to be done. And the Works Progress Administration, thank you, Judyth, did just that. They actually employed millions of people who were unemployed, and a small number of them were on special cultural agencies. And this is a really interesting thing. You could be a starving writer, and they really were starving or near it, or a homeless painter. And you could get on the Federal Art Project or the Federal Writers Project. You didn't make a lot of money, not at all, but you made enough to put a roof over your head and eat. And most importantly, you stayed active in your craft. You wrote for the government. You painted pictures and murals on walls for the government. And so the WPA, the Federal Writers Project, brought a lot of these young Black writers, brought them together, saved them from total disaster. In some cases, they found more experienced writers, both Black and white, to serve as mentors. They found colleagues across the color line. A lot of poor kids here saying, yeah, we're all trying to make it as writers. Let's support one another for a change. And the meetings, the galleries, the studios of the Federal Writers Project were like launch pads for some amazing careers. So Bontemps was, since he knew it at firsthand, and he was actually a supervisor in the Illinois office of the Federal Writers Project. He was he mentored a lot of younger Black folks coming along. So that's a big piece of the story against the backdrop of this older tradition of Black institution building, which is an important part of the story, what historians call agency, African Americans creating their own situations, their own futures. So let me just, before we move on, let me pose the question again, see if anybody else wants to take another crack at it from another angle. What was the Black Chicago Renaissance, and how was it different from Harlem? Anybody want to take a crack at that or read something else?
So I just wanted to add on what you just said. I think a part of the WPA, I think we had that ability of the Black artists to come together. You know, I think even without, I don't want to discard the WPA altogether, but I just want to say I think they were hungry enough to want to create some type of, I don't want to call it syndicate, but they were there for each other. You know, they were there for each other. They wanted to support. They wanted to create a difference. So that difference was what you stated in the beginning about the fact that, yeah, everybody wanted to just, you know, come down and impress someone or mingle with other people to get some type of opportunity. But yeah, in Chicago, the people were so desperate of greatness, that they had to come together and support each other to grow. The mentorship and just being there for each other was a great factor that made the Chicago Renaissance something really commendable for the Black artists. So the WPA just enhanced that, because again, in Chicago, they didn't have the opportunity. Harlem was, the place to be if you wanted to be hip. In Chicago, you just wanted to put your work out there. If you're a painter, you wanted people to see your work. If you're a singer, you wanted your music to be out there, a poet and everything. But so for that, you needed that community of brothers and sisters who were already advanced in the craft to hold your hand per se and take you into the work. So we have to, we have to always say the artists in Chicago had that sense of community, they had that sense of togetherness, and they were ready to work together to bring each other up.
Yeah, to add to what Cyrille said, I think it's also important to note that, as we discussed earlier, the financial collapse in the country caused the migration of African Americans from the South into these regions. They're not, if you look at the common theme, for the most part, a lot of these writers are not born and raised in Chicago. Some may have been, but a lot of them are coming from the South, bringing their experiences from the South into a completely different world for them. And I think that does tie into what we end up reading and seeing in their art. Because it's not just a reflection of past, it's what they've been through in the past, but bringing those experiences and actually seeing that at the time, you kind of look at it, the North was always considered to be, the more civilized or whatnot than the South. But the same issues were going on in the North for African Americans. The financial issues were still there. Racism was still prevalent across the North. And they were seeing that in the North as well. So it wasn't just, I wanted to be clear that it's not just folks that were born and raised in Chicago. These were folks, a lot of whom were born outside of Chicago, migrated because of financial crisis to Chicago and brought those stories along with them. And then a lot of what they were writing is what they're actually seeing or hearing from folks that are actually experiencing this. They're not, stories that are just coming out of the blue with maybe they are writing in fiction at some points, but they're writing actual things that are happening or they've seen happen. And maybe they're covering that in fiction in terms of the stories, but the actual stories that, the story that they're trying to communicate to the public are real, tangible issues that they're struggling with on a day-to-day basis. And I think that is a little bit different from the Harlem Renaissance, in the fact that the financial concerns weren't quite there as much in Harlem as you saw during the Chicago Renaissance. And I think what that really boiled down to was them being able to strip away all the flash and, as Arnold Bontemps put it, the gaudiness of it, and really just focus on the key issues at hand and trying to resolve those issues. And what that led to was a feeling of community in Chicago. And even if you go to Chicago nowadays, you still have that sense of community. And I think that's something important to note. And I think Cyrille really clearly outlined that in his last statement. So thank you for that.
Regina, I'm kind of looking at you, wondering if you want to talk about the women of the Black Chicago Renaissance. I know you've done a lot of reading on them.
Yeah, sure. So I just wanted to say that there's been also a large emphasis on identity during the Chicago Renaissance that really wasn't there before for Black women. Like Gwendolyn Brooks, for example, wrote about not just Black people in general, but women in general. For example, she has a poem called The Mother, and it's about abortions. She says in it, "Abortions will not let you forget. You remember the children you got that you did not get." And yes, that applies to women. She was writing to Black women, but it applies to all women. And it was to the point where she won the Pulitzer Prize. And when she went up on stage, they all gasped because she was a Black woman. And her writing was so racially ambiguous that they had no idea that she was Black. And same thing with Margaret Walker. She wrote specifically for Black women, but some of her poems were ambiguous. But the poem that's probably my favorite by her is called For My People. And I'll read the last stanza because I know that we all enjoyed that very much. It says, "Let a new earth rise, let another world be born. Let a bloody peace be written in the sky. Let a second generation full of courage issue forth. Let a people healing and a strength, the final clenching be the pulsing in our spirit, in our blood. Let the martial songs be written. Let the dirges disappear. Let a race of men now rise and take control. And that really spoke to me personally, because it's just like a call to action to the generations after her, such as myself and even my mother, my grandmother. It applies to all of her succeeding generations.
I'm going to just, if I may, read those last 3 lines again. Let the martial songs be written. Let the dirges disappear. Let a race of men now rise and take control. We'd probably edit that race of men today, but otherwise it kind of stands pretty striking, right? Martial song, those are songs of war, martial songs, let them be written. And dirges are kind of like funeral songs, songs of mourning. Forget about them, let them disappear, she says.
Yeah, I agree with Regina. The identity issue really touched for me. Looking back at that particular time frame, we're also looking at the framing of the African-American image. At that current time, the African-American image, specifically the men, were being portrayed in the movie Birth of a Nation, which was hugely, immensely popular at the time, as African-American men were looked upon, or in that movie, as being less than, uncivilized, violent. And I think what the Chicago Renaissance does is they slowly start to change that image. The image is never accurate, right? But that's what's being portrayed out in the public. Because that movie was so popular, the image in the public, especially for those who are not around African-American folks at the time, that's what they believed. So I think the Chicago Renaissance, they also wanted to kind of change that image. And I think they did one hell of a job doing that. So that was always, that's something that always really stuck out to me while reading all of the different works.
Absolutely. In the book, The Roots of the Black Chicago Renaissance, there's even a photo of Abbott's 2 nieces where they're portrayed as confident, young, strong women. They're seen in European style, which was perceived as very rich at the time. They're wearing, I'll quote it from the book, they're wearing angled barrettes, T-strap, high-heeled shoes, and distinctive Italian leather purses, which were very expensive items at the time. So they were really trying to reframe the image of the Black woman as well as the Black man.
I'm going to hold up the image, Regina. I don't know if anybody can actually see it. Pretend it's the PowerPoint. Those are the nieces of somebody I'm going to ask you to talk about, Robert S. Abbott. I know you know a lot about him. These are his nieces back from their grand tour of Europe, right? And very fashionable young ladies, probably. And you know, in what was that, 1932? You went to Europe, you didn't fly, there were no passenger airlines, you took a ship. And they probably traveled first class. I mean, they did things that most Black folks couldn't even dream of doing. Would you just say something about Robert S. Abbott? Because his business, his publication was a big part of the story. And I know you did some research on him.
Yeah, of course. So Robert Abbott was an American lawyer. He founded the Chicago Defender, probably one of the most important newspapers in the African-American community. And he was also an editor for that newspaper. And his mother was a slave, but his father was a German sea captain. And his newspaper really aided in trying to destroy the Jim Crow laws that were put in place and encourage Black people in the South to move north, which really helped aid in the Great Migration. And he also incorporated a lot of his faith into his newspaper. And he was, I'm not sure if I'm saying this correctly, but the Baha'i faith, he was a very religious man. So he always tried to incorporate that into it as well.
Yeah, I actually, when we talked about, when you talked about Abbott the other night, being a Baha'i, I had forgotten that. Bahai. very interesting religion. It's like a religion that believes all religions are great and they should just be incorporated into one universal religion that respects everybody, regardless of nationality or ethnicity or race. So Abbott, very interesting thing about Abbott is he was as race proud as, and that was the term in those years, as race proud as you could imagine, always advocating for Black self-determination, Black achievement, Black empowerment. And then when he found a religion that embraced everybody, he said, I'll be part of that because I've earned my universal status as part of the family of man, something like that. He also took a trip to Brazil, and he thought that in Brazil, he saw a kind of multiracial, multicultural society that might be the kind of society he would like to live in. But until then, he did everything he could to build what a later generation called Black Power on the South Side. And that newspaper was an uncompromising foe of every form of Jim Crow segregation and racism you could imagine. Folks, the sleeping car porters, railroad workers who were 100% Black in those years, they traveled through the country, and when they traveled south, they often smuggled copies of the Chicago Defender with them to get Abbott's blistering editorials read. But white folks in the South didn't much like the Chicago Defender. It was way too threatening. And Judyth, I wanted to just throw a question at you. Regina read that stirring last stanza of For My People, and you read it on Monday.
Yes, I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just wonder if you want to say anything about it. What do you love about it?
It just gives you a sense of strength, you know. It's just saying, you know, step up. We can do this, you know.
And
for my people.
It connects in my head with a word I heard a lot this evening so far, the word struggles. And maybe we should talk about the politics of the Black Chicago Renaissance.
I actually, if I could say something, Regina was talking about the women writers. And there was just Gwendolyn Brooks. I was just so impressed that she left her publisher to go and started using only Black-owned publishers so that her work could be cheaper and more widely available to Black folk who maybe couldn't have afforded it at some point. And I just thought that was a great thing to do, you know.
I love it. I love that Judy speak about that, because I've been thinking while Regina was talking about who told the story. You know, again, when the story is controlled, then we're going to have only a one-sided story. And that's what the history of Africa has been from the beginning of time up till today. It's always a one-sided story. And when you don't tell your story, you have no control over how people view you. You know, so I think what the people in Chicago did was the best thing that came out of this was the ability to tell their own story and to create an audience to receive that story and make sure that the story is passed over and over into generations. Today, we're sitting here in this conference, 4 people of color with a white professor doing this thing. Tomorrow will be a Black professor speaking about this same book with 4 maybe, you know, white students, you know. So that's the greatness of Chicago Renaissance, is the ability to tell your own story and to make sure that you put everything in place so that your story is not diluted, because the moment your story is diluted, it's not the same story anymore, you know. So it's great.
Does anybody want to say anything about the South Side Writers Group, an important part of the story? Anybody besides me?
It was about 20 writers. Most of them were new. They weren't established writers. Bontemps, Walker, Franklin Marshall Davis were all participants, and they would meet and they would read their works and critique each other's work and just kind of build each other up and help each other.
Yeah, there's an interesting piece there. It was an all-Black group. You know, Cyrille has talked about Black empowerment, supporting your fellow Blacks. Southside Writers Group, they were all young Black writers. Bontemps was probably the oldest and the most accomplished. He actually had 2 novels out when the group got started. But it was as if they needed to support each other as Black artists, understanding each other's and the various places they came from, and at the same time work in interracial situations through the Federal Writers Project, utilizing and gaining whatever advantage or what's called cultural capital they could in those integrated circles of the Federal Writers Project, while having their own thing. You know, some of you know FUBU, right? For Us, By Us. That was the FUBU thing, the Southside Writers Group. And if you go back and study, there's a lot of the documentation was quite literally lost. A lady named Fern Gaydon was the secretary, and her papers were in her aunt's house. They were destroyed in a flood. So what we have is a few accounts from people who were in the group, and we have some very important things that were written, drafted in meetings of those group, where people would just bring, hey, I got this poem, and like For My People, or this short story like Richard Wright's Big Boy Leaves Home. They bring it in, they'd read it, it would get critiqued, it would get better through the critique, and with luck, it would be out there and maybe published and find an audience, both Black and white. But that group had a particular interest that you've alluded to, Judyth and Cyrille, I think. They published a manifesto called Blueprint for Negro Writing. And it poses this question: shall Negro writing, that was the term in those days, shall Negro writing be for the Negro masses? That is, if it's written by Black folks about Black subjects, who will read it? Who's the intended audience? And, you know, those of you who read authors today, like, I don't know, well, Toni Morrison always springs to mind because she's about my favorite author, rest in peace. You read Toni Morrison or Colson Whitehead, they're going back to that question. Are there Black readers for our writers? It's great that they're read by millions of people, including lots and lots of whites, but are Black folks reading those books today? Yes, absolutely. They're standing on the shoulders of people who are in the Southside Writers Group. So anything else? I don't want to talk too much here. Somebody else, jump in.
I just want to, again, just want to add, sorry, Marcos.
Go ahead.
What you just said, Professor, I think at that time, it was important for the Black readers to read Black writers, because it just came from a place where they were forbidden from learning, being literate and all that. And even now it's important. If you want to hide something from a Black person, hide it in a book, right? So that's what it is. Black people don't read, but it's important that the Black readers, and Toni Morrison also my favorite. I actually had a poem of her that I wanted to share with everyone tonight. I think most people know the poem, which was, to me, was like it was like that identity thing I was speaking about in the beginning. The poem is called "I'm Not Seaworthy." You know, when you see the poem, you understand that, okay, she was at a whole different level when she was writing this. I'm not seaworthy. Look how the fish mistake my hair for home. I had a life like you. I shouldn't be riding the sea. I'm not seaworthy. Let me be earthbound, star fixed, mixed with sun and smacking air. Give me the smile, the magic kiss, the trick little boy death of my hand. I'm not seaworthy. Look how the fish mistake my hair for home. You know, so if a Black person read this, they understand the power of that sea journey that our ancestors took from Africa to the Americas. You know, it gives you a sense of, wow, I could do better than this. I think I should connect with myself and just give myself the power to be a better version of myself. You know, so it's important both then and now for Black readers to read, you know, Black literature.
Okay. I'm thinking we might want to move to the other two questions. Let me put out question number 2, and I think Judyth, you're going to read something towards that. It's the question number 2 is, what were the origins or causes of the Black Chicago Renaissance? That is, where did it come from? Can I turn it over to you, Judyth?
Okay, this is the introduction to Roots of the Black Chicago Renaissance. Fenton Johnson is known to contemporary readers, if known at all, as a minor Black poet whose work typically portrays a sort of urban folk misery. He was also, in fact, a talented journalist and keen observer and chronicler of African-American life, most especially in his native Chicago. A profound sense of place informed the editorials and survey articles that appeared each month in his first journal, the Champion magazine of Negro achievement. Although the Champion was national, even on occasion international in scope, its March 1917 issue was devoted entirely to the city of Chicago. Johnson cautioned his readers to think of Chicago as we would think of Paris or of the West Side in New York City, or even of Boston, would be literary folly. Her factories, her mail order houses, and her stockyards are her monuments. Her poets and her artists live in the glow of her commercial and social greatness. Comparing cultural achievements and energies in other locales, he continued. Dayton gave us our representative poet, Paul Laurence Dunbar. New York, our greatest actors, including Charles S. Gilpin, George Walker, and Burt Williams. Maryland, our first race leader, Frederick Douglass. Virginia, our industrial leaders, primarily Booker T. Washington. And Chicago is the city that has evolved the supremely great colored businessman. Building on his evident pride in the South Side's racially assertive entrepreneurial culture, Johnson further expressed a desire to see colored Chicago both produce and encourage distinctive Negro literature and art, and give the world pictures of both the realistic and the emotional side of Negro life in this unique city. Johnson's stated desire would only approach realization some 2 decades later in the historical and conceptual space that has come to be known as the Black Chicago Renaissance. Yet his sense of place, of the need for close attention to that which is geographically, historically, and culturally local and distinct in African-American creative expression and commercial and social greatness, might serve as touchstone for some 21st century scholars committed to recovering such understudied or forgotten writers, artists, and intellectuals, to remapping African-American cultural geography, and to rethinking the paradigm of Black cultural renaissance. Roots of the Black Chicago Renaissance, New Negro Writers, Artists, and Intellectuals, 1893 to 1930, advances each of these 3 broad scholarly agendas.
Thank you, Judyth. And thank you guys for listening to a somewhat dry piece of academic prose, despite my best efforts to bring it to life by focusing on this very interesting character named Fenton Johnson. There's 3 threads there that run through that second book. I'm just going to read again and ask you guys if you want to, grab onto one of those threads and talk about it. One is the recovery of lost artists and writers and intellectuals, these figures from the past that were known once upon a time, but that pretty much no one knows about today. What does it mean to recover those lost artists? Who is actually talked about in the book? Who was recovered, so to speak? Another concept, I call them the 3 R's: recovery, remapping. What's the idea of remapping African American cultural geography? What does it mean? How do we do it? And then rethinking the concept of urban Black Renaissance. And of course, we're talking about both Harlem and Chicago. Anybody want to grab a piece of that, or any of those 3 threads? Have anything to say?
Yeah, I think the remapping of, I think that always sticks out to me. Growing up, we've already discussed this multiple times. That we always hear about the Harlem Renaissance, but more than the Harlem Renaissance, Black culture is, for me, growing up in New York, was always either centered in New York or down south, and that's pretty much where it lived. When we hear the stories, they're either down south, or everyone comes to New York and then thrives in New York, or something along those lines. And there's so much more to it. When we, Chicago, I don't want to say it's been forgotten, because we do have fantastic writers even to this day that are standing on the shoulders of those writers that were in Chicago at that particular time frame. And we'll probably touch base on that a little bit later on in this conversation. But I think there needs to be a remapping to understand that someone like Fenton Johnson, who maybe not as popular as some of the other writers that we've come to know, people stand on his shoulders. And because of him, the others are now able to come forward and write. And Fenton Johnson, for me, The Daily Grind is one of the poems he wrote, to me, really, encapsulates, even today, if you read that poem, it really goes into the system and how we're always working in that daily grind. And if I can just read this, the one, I won't even go into the full stanza. I'll just read the 1 or 2 little lines that are really always stuck out to me when he writes, "You can only die each morning and live again in the dreams of the night." To me, that's just paramount of the struggle. You can struggle and struggle, but you can always dream and push for more. And that's how I kind of took that line. And I think that's why we need to remap it, because figures like Fenton Johnson with lines like that get lost if we do not remap it. So I think it's important to do that.
Remapping, recovery, rethinking. Anybody else?
I think we can rethink pieces from that era by connecting it to what's going on now. For example, what happened during the Chicago Renaissance is similar to what happened last year with the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. People were in the depression, they were really down, and great things came out of it. And similar to last year, the pandemic, really was almost like an awakening for a lot of Black individuals, in my opinion, because yes, we were tired of the police murdering Black people. And since we were at home not working, a lot of people were angry and went to the streets and marched and protested. And I really feel like, although it did not change the system completely, because I feel like the system cannot be changed that quickly or not by a few marches, but there were changes that came about that were significant.
Yes, and in Ann Petrie's story, In Darkness and Confusion, she wrote about a young Black soldier being killed by a white policeman in a hotel lobby, and how that led within a couple hours to the Harlem riots. So written so long ago, but so relatable, in this time now.
And to kind of piggyback off of Judyth and Regina, to me, the one that always really stands out, the short story by Richard Wright, The Man Who Lived Underground, I think is just a beautiful story and really encapsulates what happens when you continually put stress and oppress people, what ends up happening. In that story, a man gets accused of something he did not do. And because of that accusation, he ends up living underground. He gets to hear these stories from other people while he's underground, but at the same time, he's now living underground with no means, really in a very difficult, tough situation, which he then eventually commits a crime. and then ends up being killed because of that. So it really, to me, just goes to show what happens when you continually stress a population, oppress a population, and then turn around and say, well, no one's doing, they're not thriving because, you know, they're lazy or whatever the narrative is in the media. When the reality is, no, you're stressing and you're oppressing folks through your system. And now you're complaining when people aren't thriving the way you believe they should or should not. So I think looking at Richard Wright's The Man Who Lived Underground really is a great analogy for that. And it's a story that if you have not read, I think if you can get your, you know, maybe an hour out of your day and kind of just breeze through that one really quick, I think it'll make your day a little bit better.
I think we really do have a jam session going on now. Let me go back to my favorite subject, Fenton Johnson, and his best known poem. It's called Tired. It was written in 1919, what was called the Red Summer, the summer that there were so-called, they're so-called race riots. They were actually racist attacks on Black communities across the country. Horrible, horrible crimes. In that year, Fenton Johnson, who had published a absolutely terrific magazine, little journal called The Champion Magazine of Negro Achievement, he wrote this poem, just the first 2 lines. I am tired of work. I am tired of building up somebody else's civilization. You know, like somebody else's civilization. You know, what's the resonance there? What do we get from? I'm tired of work. I'm tired of building up somebody else's civilization.
Blacks were never considered part of the civilization, you know. So for them, they always felt like they were working for someone else's civilization, you know. And I think one of the third thing that I wrote down about the Chicago Renaissance was a contribution to civilization, you know. And it's funny that you bring this up. Contribution to whose civilization? And that's a question I asked myself. Was contribution to whose civilization? Was it contribution to the Black civilization? Was it contribution to the American civilization? You know, was this beneficial to us as Black people or just to the rest of the country? So I truly understand his reflection on that. Is at some point, and Marcos said it, you get tired and you feel like you don't belong. You know, and I think the Harlem Renaissance, Chicago Renaissance, all this was happening just for a sense of belonging, you know, to say, you know what, we are part of this thing. You know, we own something, we're part of this thing. So it is again, where we are today as a society, Regina spoke about it. We think it's very, very far because of the late 1893 to 1920, but it's the same thing that we live in today, you know. And recovery is important because if we don't recover, we can't understand what was happening then. You know, we have to be able to read to understand what was happening there so that we could see that, okay, wow, they succeeded during that time. It means we can succeed now. You know, we can stand on their shoulders and succeed as well.
I think we've been nibbling at the third question for a while now, so let me just state it. Let me make it explicit. You know, we've formulated it slightly differently every week, but it's basically, what's the point? What's the value to us today, whether we're white, Black, or Asian, or whatever, of going back and reading these authors from earlier periods, learning about these events in African-American cultural history? What do we get from it? What's the takeaway? Why do it?
Yeah, structure. I said it in our last meeting. Structure, something that struck enough for me. The Black writers came together, supported each other, worked to be better. That structure is something that we're lacking today. as a people. Everybody's doing their own thing. And again, I understand, we live in a capitalistic society where everybody wants to be the best at what they do and succeed financially or whatever. But I think what the people in the Chicago Renaissance had was a structure. They had a structure. They knew what to do for their people to get the resources. If I'm going to publish with a white publisher and my people are not going to get the book, I'm going to change and go to a black publisher. If we can't do this together as a people, let's create some type of, where we meet all the time as a group of writers to empower each other. It's a structure. They had structure. We struggling with the structure issue right now, and we could learn a lot. Again, I was speaking in the beginning about my 10 years old son. He's an author. He published his first book on Amazon last year, and we publishing his second book on his trip to the George Floyd Memorial. And me reading that piece of writing was like, wow, he's 10 years old already asking himself questions about what it means to be a Black child in America. So I have to challenge him. This book, I was talking to him yesterday, I was like, Zen, I have a reading for you. I was like, you're not going to just dive in it right now, but I want to go through this book with you because I want you to embed yourself with these great people that were here before you so that you understand your greatness. Again, it's a passion for you to be an author at 10 years old, but ask yourself, where did this come from? This came from greatness. They were already great Black author before me. So I'm just following in the footsteps of great. And that gives him a sense of identity, a sense of pride. It makes him take this even more seriously than me just encouraging him to write. So that's what we need to reconnect these two periods so that we understand who we are as a people.
Yeah, and to add to Cyrille, he beautifully stated that beyond just reading just amazing literature, because if you do get a chance to read any of this stuff, it's really amazing. Beyond that, it's understanding that some of the same struggles that they were going through at those time frames are very real today. Some of those same issues that they bring up in a lot of their stories, whether it's a fiction or a short story, a lot of those issues still are present today. And also understanding for any race, whether for me being Latino or for African Americans, carrying that culture, that history with you, it's like as Cyrille just said, it's a kind of an empowerment and of pride, and being able to not lose those and not let society whitewash those stories, because they will if you let them. So making sure that those stories, as we said earlier, are told through the lens that they should be told through. I think that's super important, and understanding how those struggles were met at that time. And you can kind of grasp through some of those. And yeah, the time frames are a bit different now than they were then, but you can still kind of learn from that and what they did, the structure and the discipline that Cyrille always comes back to is something that we can always take forward with us as well. And I think for me, having an African-American son, it's super important for him to understand what happened, where he comes from. I want to read a quick little passage. During the Chicago World's Fair, there was Frederick Douglass had a speech during the Chicago World's Fair, and they were just struggling of kind of how to identify African Americans at the time. But I think this last passage, a little excerpt of his speech, I think for me really hit home, and something that I think would help kind of wrap this up here. And he says, it has been affirmed on the one hand and denied on the other that the Negro, since emancipation, has made commendable progress. I affirm that no people emancipated under the same conditions could have made more commendable progress than has the Negro in the same length of time. Under the whole heavens, there never was an enslaved people emancipated under more unfavorable circumstances or started from a lower condition in life. And even starting from that standpoint, here we are with, a few years later. Let's not forget, Frederick Douglass was a slave. He writes that as a freedman, not long after, and the strides that were made in a very short period of time. Just speak to the greatness of the culture, the history, and that's why we need to continue that forward, because if not, it will be whitewashed.
Just a footnote, Douglass delivered that speech at the Chicago World's Fair in August 1893. So thank you, Marcos. You just sort of time traveled us back, if my math is accurate, 128 years. Is it worth hearing those words again?
Yeah, Marcos is good at that.
Yeah. So, what's the value? What's the point? Before we open to the whole audience, may I ask Regina or Judyth, what do you guys get out of this? What would you like folks to be thinking about?
I just want to say to everyone that we need to remember that this was not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. This was pretty recent. And although we have come a long way, we still have so much farther to go. And we really all need to take the steps to make conditions better for African Americans in America.
And I like the way the Black people tried to raise each other up, and they, they helped each other and encouraged each other, in their writings, and, they just gave encouragement, and, which sometimes is all you need, just a little bit of encouragement.
Yeah. You can probably see me beaming with pride at my co-presenters here. This has been wonderful. I'm thinking it looks to be about 8:15 or thereabouts. If you guys, the four of you, have nothing further that you want to add, maybe we should open it up to the floor. I think I need to turn this over to Professor Tim. It looks like a bunch of chat comments, and maybe some people want to just speak.
We have questions.
Oh.
Our first question is, this is very interesting. How would one exactly go about recovering these lost artists? What steps would an individual take to remap them?
I have an answer. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think first and foremost is how bad do you want to recover it? I think it all comes down to the individual. For me, it was extremely important to understand not just the stories, the culture in general. So for me personally, I went on a quest of trying to understand it better. And once I knew that I wanted to understand it, the first step I took was, one of the first steps I took was coming to this class. And in that you can recover it. But also reading new art, Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example, reading Ta-Nehisi Coates now, who's an amazing writer, and understanding that he was influenced by Richard Wright. If you look at a lot of his books, I believe it's Between the World and Me, if I'm not mistaken, which was actually a riff on Richard Wright's short story. The way that book is framed and the different phases that it's framed in is a riff on Richard Wright's A Native Son, and how that book was framed in the different phases. So I think one is understanding how bad do you really want to recover this stuff, and then going about that way. But you could also, and not only just taking, obviously we're going to promote Professor Courage and taking his course, but reading current authors and understanding that these authors were also influenced by some of the writers that we've just discussed. And I think we live in an age where everything's at our fingertips. So you're a Google search away from a Richard Wright short story or Arnold Boone Temp's poem or something along those lines. So to start, if you weren't aware of the Chicago Renaissance, which a lot of us were not, just Google that and you'll start coming across a lot of these names that you've heard tonight.
Well, our next question is actually along that point, Marcus. Thanks. Someone posted, I am inspired to read more. Could each person on the panel suggest one book or I think it means writer, one book or writer I could read?
I would suggest new Negro writers, artists, and intellectuals, 1893 to 1930. That's the first thing you have to get your hand on, and Museum Brownsville. I wish I could find the video of a radio interview, Professor. That totally changed. It didn't change, but it started a whole revolution in my mind. It was like a mental revolution, because I had the privilege to receive my professor on my radio show. So I had to read the book and understand the book, and then try to take out every nuances in there. So when he came at the radio station, we had an intense discussion, and after that, that was it. I fell in love with my story. I fell in love with myself. I fell in love with who I was as a Black person. I fell in love as a father of an African American, as a brother of an African American. I stopped looking at before coming to America, the media made me feel like African Americans were different from me. No, we're the same people. We're just a borderline difference, so sometimes we overthink the process. If you get your hand on the closest thing you can have is going to create a mental revolution, and that will be the beginning of your breakthrough. So that's just for me.
I have a question. My question is, the types of programs that they had back then for the struggling writers, the struggling Black writers, which was the WPA, do they have any type of programs like that exist now for some of our African Americans writers that might be struggling to get their work out, or anybody to even see their work?
That I'm aware of, I know that in Philadelphia, Mark Lamont Hill, who's a correspondent on BET, he actually owns a coffee shop called Uncle Bobby's, and they do have writers projects there. You can actually go on YouTube and see a lot of their works there as well. In New York, I'm not quite sure. I'm sure there are, and I'm sure if you want to drop your email, I can pretty much research it for you and get you some information on that. But that I know off the top of my head, I know, for example, Mark Lamont Hill does have a writer's project in Philadelphia at his coffee shop / bookstore called Uncle Bobby's. So that's one place I would say you could look at. Now, again, that's a Black-owned coffee shop / bookstore.
Uncle Bobby's. Okay.
There's it sort of depends on what you write. There's a very famous poets group that is very much intended to bring young Black poets along. It has a Latin name, Cave Canem, beware of the dog. It's kind of a joke. And one of the organizers is a very distinguished poet that Professor Tim featured last year, Etheridge Knight. I honestly forget where they are located, but if you take down the spelling, C-A-V-E, first word like cave, but pronounced cave, C-A-V-E, Canem, C-A-N-E-M, you just look up that group, see what's going on with them, possibility. I'm wondering, Professor Tim, you are connected with Nuyorican Poets Cafe and all kinds of circles of aspiring writers. You have anything you want to say about how somebody who's just getting into this, where to go? Maybe if you're at WCC, for example, where you go?
Yeah, sure. Nuyorican actually has Nuyorican is located on 3rd Street, downtown Lower East Side, between Avenues B and C. And with Nick Powers and I both co-host the College Slam at that venue. But Nuyorican's been closed, right, since the pandemic. It actually hasn't opened up yet, but there are a lot of online events that have continued through the pandemic. Nick and I hosted a show called Word, and it was just basically a workshop, an open mic. So that in that venue, all artists, all poets were invited to participate, to write something during the 90 minutes, and then to read it to the group. There's a Monday night open mic that's also on Zoom. Just if you go to any of the social media like Facebook or Instagram, you can connect with the Nuyorican. Also, if you just go to NuyoricanPoetsCafe.com, and there is a slam on Wednesday night and on Friday night, and that's a lot of fun. That's not participatory unless you want to slam, right? If you want to slam, then yeah, you certainly can participate. But if you're curious about slam poetry, that would be the way to do it. As far as in-person venues, they're just starting to come back. There are some usually there's sort of like intimate settings where you get an invitation, but I know that some of the bigger poetry events are just starting to come back now. But if anyone's interested, why don't you email me? Christine, I'll put it in the chat. I'll put it in the chat. And if you're really interested in coming out to a poetry event, yeah, I'll send you some options. Unfortunately, most of the ones I know are in Manhattan. We used to have some, again, pre-pandemic, we used to have White Plains Slam, but that hasn't started up again either. But there are a few online options.
I think that was an awesome question, Brenda. I think there's the Harlem Writers Guild have events for Black writers. The Schomburg, the Schomburg Library has a lot of events for Black writers. You walk in, I've done that before. Nothing. I just walked in and before you know, in 20 minutes into your walking in, you're already speaking with a good writer and they're ready to help you do something. So sometimes you just have to just walk in and in those spaces, and you will surely meet someone that's there to assist you and connect you with the right people.
Or word from our sponsor, creative writing class at WCC. By all means, we got some great folks teaching those courses. I'm not one of them, I should say, but there are some wonderful creative writing professors and great courses online, hopefully in person.
Oh my gosh, I should have mentioned Professor Rashawn Allen,
Indeed.
who was a poet himself and did the Poets and Writers series last semester. He would be a great choice, really, for the studying creative writing at the college. Yeah, we have a few more questions. You want to keep going? Yeah, we have a lot. I don't know if we can get to all of them. What would a modern version of the Chicago and Harlem Renaissance look like? In other words, what would a modern African American cultural movement look like today in 2021?
Well, I was going to take us back to, let's say, the late 60s and 70s. Read about the Black Arts movement if you want to make it more modern. Folks like the late Amiri Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, Carolyn Rogers, Haki Madhubuti, some New Yorkers, some Chicagoans, some other parts. I would study that, and I would think about where are there communities where there is African American cultural creativity joined with Black agency and institution building. Okay, look at those pieces, and maybe in the best world, with some federal money infused to kickstart it all, but not totally outside the control of the Black artists themselves. That is a key issue there. There's a lot to learn from Harlem in the 20s, Chicago in the 30s and 40s, and many places in the country in the late 60s and 70s. The Black arts movement was quite revolutionary in its own way, and some people said it was the cultural wing of the Black Power movement. So.
I would add to that. After the George Floyd incident, what I did see was an influx of a lot of African American writers. And there's a group of 4 or 5 that I continually read. They're not necessarily a group as the Southside Writers Project, but they nevertheless, you can see they bounce ideas off of each other. And I've actually brought these books up in conversation before. That would be the 3 or 4 authors I'm really referring to are Eddie Glaude Jr., who's a professor of African American Studies in Princeton. He has a book out called Begin Again, really kind of looking at James Baldwin. Imani Perry, another professor at Princeton University. They kind of bounce ideas off of each other. She has a book out, Looking for Lorraine, which is actually an autobiography on Lorraine Hansberry, speaking of Chicago. And then Kiesi Lehman has a wonderful memoir called Heavy. And then Sarah Bloom, I believe, has a book called The Yellow House. So all 4 of these, they're not necessarily their own writers project, but you can see, if you even go on YouTube, you'll see interviews between all 4 of them having these conversations. So I think that's another really a good place to start if you're looking to kind of get into some of this stuff.
More questions?
Yes, someone's asking Regina and Judyth specifically to recommend some books from a female perspective.
Like I was talking about before, this is not a specific book, but Gwendolyn Brooks in general is just probably my favorite Black author in America. Her poetry is amazing as it pertains to women, mostly Black women, but women as a whole. And I just think that her poetry is very powerful.
I also would recommend Gwendolyn Brooks and also Margaret Walker. Her writing is phenomenal too. That I would definitely recommend.
Thank you. And we have another question, two questions that are sort of similar. Someone writes, I'm not African American. What can you tell me why I should be taking an African American literature class? Someone asked a similar question, how important is it for non-African Americans to learn about African American history and literature, and what books can you start reading to learn about it?
I think a lot of the books have been mentioned, but why is a great question. Why do white folks like me? What do we get? My short answer is African American history is American history, and we better come to terms with that. Who built America? A lot of those folks had Black faces and didn't choose to build America, but they sure as hell did. Just read about the cotton economy under slavery. And same thing with the literature. The richest, not the only, by no means the only, but some of the richest strains in American literature comes from the long and rich tradition of African American literature. So white folks, I don't speak for us now, you want to understand this country, read Black literature and history, because it's please.
I'm going to add on to that, Professor. The miseducation of the masses starts with studying the people. I think we've been very, very misinformed for a long time. You know, it doesn't matter, African, white, everybody, but the real story have not been told. And I think taking classes like this, as we said from the beginning, is going to change your perception of what you thought your neighbor was in the first place. You know, if what the media have been portraying is just showing you that we don't read, we don't write, we can't do anything with our lives, and then you go back and take a class or study the African American history, is going to change your perception. You're going to understand that, wow, these people are not just who I thought they were. So I think even if it's not just to be an ally, but just for your own personal growth, it is very important to take these classes and read the books.
Yeah, and I won't try to, I think Professor Courage stated it perfectly. It's not African American history only, it's American history. It's also important, to Cyrile's point, is making sure that you're getting the true story, right? Typically, we hear the story come from the mouth of the oppressor, not the oppressed. So I think it's important to get the story from the oppressed. And to the question of where would you start, I think two really good places you could start, fairly simple and easy reads, are the Autobiography of Frederick Douglass. It's a very good read, kind of gives you a holistic perspective of what he went through as a slave, and then what he ends up becoming after. And then also Cornel West's Race Matters, I think is a very good book to kind of outline, even though it was written more than a decade ago now, it kind of does outline still what's currently going on. So I think you'll get a little flavor of both history and something a little more current there.
And might I add, while we're doing autobiographies, the autobiography of Malcolm X and Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, the title being a tribute to the poetry of Paul Laurence Dunbar. Add those in to enrich the mix of books on your shelves.
I have it somewhere.
Okay, well, thank you so much. There are so many more questions that we didn't get to. I want to thank Professor Courage and his scholars, Judyth, Regina, Cyrille, and Marcos. My goodness, it was so informative and such a rich discussion. I want to thank you all for that. Thanks to the audience for coming and listening and sticking around and asking all your questions. could tell that there's so much activity. I don't know if you guys, you scholars, can see the chat. There's so much activity here, with questions and comments. I mean, I'm telling you, as far as poets and writers go, our sessions go, this is really quite lively. And thanks to Mitch, our technician. We really appreciate your work, and thanks to Paula Rubenstein, who was former Smart Arts director, who really supported us this semester and approved this session in particular. So I hope we see you all again in the spring. Please, join us again, and you can unmute yourselves right now and give applause and appreciation to scholars.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
This is great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was
I do
fabulous.
appreciate
Thank you. Yeah.